Yes, unmute. I saw that.
Anyway, again, good evening, everyone. I'm Tim Waddell. I am Director of DIF for NSF sponsored program over on St. Thomas campus. I'm here with my colleagues from the Caribbean Green Technology Center and from Vitima. In the audience, we have Deputy Director Regina Brown and other colleagues from Vitima joining us tonight. So thank you, everyone, and we have folks online. So I will go ahead and start the presentation. And thanks a lot.
Okay.
Here we go. So the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan, it's actually mandated by FEMA to have an updated version of the plan. It's every 5 years. And it's necessary if the territory or region or state that is submitting a plan, if they want to be eligible for pre and post mitigation funding, which is now the BRIC program. The other opportunity for the plan is to identify issues and opportunities that could be funded from various other agencies. And then finally, this town hall is an opportunity for us to generate and stimulate public support for recovery, resilience, and risk reduction initiatives. And so the plan and especially these town halls are really essential for getting local buy-in and understanding. Next slide, please. So why is this so important? And we have a graph here that actually captures what happens after a major event. So we're looking at just the element of employment, the change in employment, and looking at 4 major events or 3 major events: Hurricanes Hugo, Maryland, the combination of Irma and Maria, and then also looking at what happened in Puerto Rico. So what we see is that the economy, depending on the severity of the storm and the impact, really hits every sector, but especially our employment, because obviously we're a tourism-based economy. And so when we see the kind of devastation we saw in 2017, tourism drops off, and most of our resources and energy is repairing our homes and what have you on the personal level, but also the fact that our economy is in shambles. And so what you see here is the change in employment, and let's just look at the red line, which is here in the Virgin Islands, and you can see after Irma and Maria, we had a major drop off. What is unique about this is the fact that we are looking at the amount of time after those events. How long did it take us to recover back to a sort of a baseline employment level? And for Irma and Maria, we almost went to 18, 20 months before we got back to normal on the unemployment rate. If you look at Puerto Rico, they were able to recover far more quickly. But here in the Virgin Islands, the reality is that it takes us some time after Irma, after Hugo or Maryland, it still takes a bit of time to recover. And what we have to recognize is the role of hazards and how they create shocks that set us back collectively for many years. And as I just illustrated, Irma and Maria was probably the most devastating because of the severity of the damage. We're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of about $10 million just in our territory. And obviously, the other thing that we've seen since then is, and this has happened after every storm, we've seen immigration away from the territory, just people that are either because of the loss of jobs or their homes or what have you, drives people out. And we'll speak more to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So what makes this plan different is that the traditional hazard mitigation plan, the most recent one, was done in 2019, and it followed a very traditional set of objectives, which we conveniently call mitigation planning. And so the first thing we do is identify and characterize the hazards and risks to the territory. This is tsunamis, earthquakes, drought, obviously hurricanes, all the different hazards that occur with some frequency in the territory, and then the level of risk that's associated with it. once you have an understanding of that, then you can start thinking about what are the strategies that we might turn to figure out how to reduce risk to those various hazards. And the idea there is, look at our local resources, look at our capacity, and then develop something that's practical and realistic to reduce risk. And then ultimately, we have to implement those strategies to actually mitigate or manage that risk in the long run. And so ultimately what we're doing is addressing the impact of hazards that cause stressors or damage to our society. By adding the term resilience, we're adding 2 additional levels of practice and thinking into our planning effort. And so once you get to this sort of how to implement it, if you want to really implement mitigation strategies, you have to think more broadly. And so one of the things we've done here is address the underlying conditions and systems, and you'll see this coming up in the next slide. But the idea is to understand what is our capacity to mitigate and manage risk. What do we need to do? What do we need to understand as we look at all the different systems that provide a modern society with all of those services and amenities. And then from there, we can then start thinking about how do we build resilience, and we'll speak more to what that means in a moment. But the idea is to address the impact of the hazards that cause stress, and then look at how to improve operations and governance to reduce recovery expenditures and time. Remember going back to that previous slide, how it took us almost 18 months to get back to our employment level that we saw after Hurricane Maria. And so the idea is, can we shorten that? Next slide. So this is sort of a graphic illustration of where we were, where we got to, and then what are some of our objectives in doing so. So think of August 2017 instead of stage 1, whatever it was here in the territory, the way things function, our schools, our telecommunications, our government, everything. This is where we were. Then we had the storm. And so what we see, just as we saw in the employment, we see a dip. We see a dip both in time and in cost. And so the deeper the dip, the higher the cost, and then obviously the time element this way. So a more resilient system, again, we'll speak more to this in a moment, but the idea is a more resilient system will recover quickly and less expensively. However, if for whatever reason you are a less resilient system, and one could make that argument for the Virgin Islands, the fact is a less resilient system may take longer, may cost more, and in fact, if as we saw after Hurricane Maria, we had the pandemic, which really slowed down the progress we could make, and we may end up in a different state. It may not be as, where it used to be, but it's in a different state. But the key thing here is that, the reality is that if we have good operations, good governance, both in the public sector and the private sector, we can build more resilient systems and speed up that recovery. And so what we have to do, or have to think about when we build resilience, is look at those underlying conditions that make a community and its system unable or slow to rebound. Next slide. So the plan itself has sort of 5 real key components or principles that guide the development of the plan. And so we've been speaking about resilience. We also have to think about sustainability here in the territory. Whatever we invest in, whether it's infrastructure in our communities, how sustainable is it? Is it sustainable because of the people or the resources or whatever? But we have to look at that because we make the investment, and if it's short-sighted or ineffective, it will be very difficult to sustain it. This is one of the first plans in the country that actually is now looking at climate adaptation and the impacts of climate change. And so that influences the risk and the vulnerability and the hazards. And so that's an important element. The other piece to think about is the social and cultural awareness, meaning think about your communities, the composition, who's in them, how are they being, how are they treated, who is vulnerable, who's less vulnerable, how diverse is your community, and every part of the country has a different social cultural awareness. But here in the territory, we're highly diverse. There's a lot of change in our population. New people, whether it's immigrants or people moving to the toward this is we've also lost a lot of people over the last 5-10 years as well. And so understanding how communities work together or don't work together influences the social cultural awareness. And then finally, the capacity building. What is our ability to rebuild? And whether it's through our education system, training workers for the future, whether it's our ability to, manage major reconstruction projects, or, our basic essential services like our hospitals, what's the state of our health system, our economy, all of these influence our ability to build capacity. Next one. So, again, the resilience, we're focusing on the hazards, the sectors and systems. And so I mentioned these hazards in the beginning, the earthquakes, tsunamis, and landslides. Due to climate change, we're seeing stronger and more intense storms like we saw in Loma Maria. We've also, for the last 5 years or so, we've been experiencing droughts. I'll speak more to that in a bit. And then obviously one of the other side effects of climate change is we're seeing sea level rise and higher temperatures. So the heat we experienced last fall with our schools here in St. Croix, perfect example. So those are the hazards, and the traditional hazard mitigation plan really, and FEMA in particular, really focuses on the critical infrastructure. We want to get this back up and running as soon as possible. And that's how FEMA has traditionally thought about it and responded to it. And in most places, it's a very important element. But the fact is, we also have to look at the essential services, because what we do on this side, the state of our economy, housing, education, health, and so forth, these are the things, our workers that support them rely on these services. And so together, if you don't look at this and you only look at that, your chances of successful mitigation strategies are going to be, regardless of whether you look at it, are going to be impacted by these elements. And so when you think about, this is what takes care of the people that do this work. And so the idea is by integrating them together, this is how we map out the plan and hopefully build a more resilient Virgin Islands. Next one. So this is really the schematic of both our partners as well as the process and outcomes. So we've talked about a little bit of, the analysis, the risk analysis and assessments. We've done the profiles of the hazards, risk assessment, and the sustainability. We've also talking to various sectors and communities, both, professionals in the various sectors, but also looking at our ability to do the work here. This is where we've done the stakeholder engagement. And then through this process, started developing mitigation strategy and a planning framework. And this is part of the outcomes, along with speaking with folks like myself today and in previous meetings, we've generated a plan. We could not have done this without the support of our partners, folks at BBI, by TEMA, obviously the government, but we've had partners like the Naval Postgraduate School, a variety of consultants, other university experts. These are subject matter experts that complement the team that we have here in the territory. And together, we've generated the plan. And ultimately, the idea is that resilience has really guided our activities, the research that went into the plan, as well as our understanding. And it's really how we look at the whole process through that sort of resilience lens. Thank you. So one of the things, the plan has 3 main goals or 3 main takeaways. And I think the key thing here is, obviously, the more traditional thing is that how do we manage risk, which is ultimately what we always want to do with the hazard mitigation plan, is manage that risk. But with the resilience thinking, we've also started to realize the interconnectedness of the systems here in the territory that rely on each other to function. And whether it's during good times, sunny skies, or stormy, pre-storm or post-storm, you have to think about how these systems work together. And what drives that or influences that is how we practice governance. So this is at every level, from at the university to the governor and everyone else. How do we take care of our systems? How do we manage risk? Who's doing the work? We need all 3 of these elements to generate a resilient Virgin Islands. And I think the systems approach and good governance, we can't do it without. And so I think the plan leaves us with an approach that basically we're arguing for an adaptive management of risk. And these risks are changing all the time. In fact, there's climate change, some elements are accelerating, some elements are becoming more extreme. And then between that and our systems, the people, the community, our resources are going to evolve over time. And a lot of that is driven by climate change. So next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Greg Ronell, who's going to walk you through these three goals in more detail. Thank you.
You just press this button.
Sorry?
You just press this button for next slide.
Oh.
Oh, I'm going too far.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so I'm gonna take up from where Kim was, and continue and sort of go one by one over all those different goals and some of the findings. So okay, next time. Next, that's the previous slide.
Oh. No.
We're going back at the bottom.
Right. I can't use.
It's this one.
Oh, sorry. Okay, got it.
So the next slide.
Hold on. I know, it's just some. Sorry. What? I'm hitting the spot.
Oops. Oh. Sorry, guys. You press this side of the.
Yeah.
This, you are pressing that side. That's
All right.
right. So
We got
let me
to
go
go to the slide. Recording has stopped. Where was this little technical difficulty here?
okay, you press this side.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah. Yep.
And now we have to get over here.
Okay, very good.
Uh,
You just press this side.
Yeah.
Okay.
you ready to go back or?
No.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption.
So yes, so now what we're gonna do is we're just gonna go hazard by hazard. Some of you have seen some of those results already. And as Kim mentioned, we, what's that? Oh, you wanna remove the, yeah,
Much better?
It's the banner on top.
There you go.
I'm trying to go back. Poisonous. Go back. Okay, good.
So like I was saying, so you've seen some of those before, but we conducted this analysis for all the sectors that Kim mentioned. So the health sector, the school, the power sector, the government building, all of that. So what we cannot go over that right now because we need to information. So I've just provided some, tidbits, snippets of some findings for some of the sectors at the bottom. If you want more information, you go on the plan, and for the sector that interests you, you can just read the particular document. So in this case, this is the map of hurricane wind speed in the territory. On top of it, we superimpose residential building, commercial building, hotels. We have, like I said, we have done this analysis for different type of systems. So we have another map where we can look at, what does it mean for the power infrastructure, water assets, for example, etc. So in this case, what we see is that if, say, for example, the territory is experiencing a Category 4 hurricane, so wind speed will be, around 130 to 150 miles per hour along the coast. As you go up in elevation, this wind speed will increase. So people up above will experience stronger wind speeds that can reach Category 5 conditions. What we find is that on St. Thomas and St. John in particular, and that's no surprise, 50% of the home would experience Category 5 hurricane, while homes that are lower elevation would experience a Category 4 hurricane. So 56% of hotels, 16% of hotel on St. 56% of hotel on St. John, and 60% of hotel on St. Thomas would also experience a Cat 5, while the other building would experience a Cat 4. So what it means is that those buildings are in sort of higher risk, more vulnerable to damage and destruction. And it's the fact that so many of the commercial building and assets are in such a high risk zone sort of raises question about the economy, which is important if we are talking about a recovery from an economic standpoint. Next slide. This is rain-induced flooding. We experienced a lot of it in the past 2 weeks. So we have a sense of the fact that in many places when it rains, it floods. One thing we found is that most of the flooding occurs outside of hurricane. Hurricane season is supposed to start in, let's say, 2 months from now, and yet the last week we experienced one of the highest rainfall record in the territory. In Puerto Rico, it was the highest. In San Juan, it was the highest in 100 years for this time of year. And for St. Thomas and John, I'm still questioning the number, but we are definitely in the sort of record number. For St. John, it's the highest ever recorded since they started recording in the past 10, 15 years. So what we had last week happened, and now it's sunny, right? We don't have a hurricane and stuff like that, but there was a lot of flooding, and then we go back to heat. Nevertheless, a lot of buildings, government building in this case, are in the flood zone, including the government house in St. Croix, the legislature building on St. Thomas, the Supreme Court on St. Thomas. A lot of buildings that are critical for the functioning of the territory are in the flood zone, in addition to all the homes and even some shelters also are in the flood zone. We did a fair amount of work on this particular hazard because it's one of the most sort of persistent, one of the most, the one that occurs the most often. And what we have found is that we don't actually have a good understanding of the different ways that water flows in the territory. So this is an improvement from what FEMA did 7 years ago, but more work needs to be done to better understand some of the flood zone in the territory, to have a better understanding of what flooding risk is. We know that this is an improvement, but it is an underrepresentation of the actual risk. Next slide. A lot of this flooding, what we're finding, a lot of this flooding is actually driven by some of the changes that we did in land. I will show you what that means in a minute. This is earthquake. On St. Thomas, we've actually experienced 2 earthquakes in the last 15 days. I don't know if you experienced any earthquake on St. Croix. I don't think you have. Most of the earthquake that we experience in St. Thomas tend to be generated by the BVI. It's a very, very active sort of region. I think the last one we had was almost a magnitude 4 earthquake. Nevertheless, what we find is that the type of risk that we have when it comes to earthquake in St. Thomas and St. John is similar, if not higher, than the region of atmospheres in Puerto Rico. And I don't know if you remember 2018, the type of damage that was experienced in Puerto Rico is something that we can experience here in the territory, especially the fact that a lot of those homes on St. Thomas and St. John are on steep slopes. A lot of them are built on stilts. And those are two factors that even increase the risk much higher than what is represented in this map, because this map only sort of assume the ground surface and just look at the acceleration of the rock, not the building. And like I said, being on a slope and being on stilts increase the shaking of the structure and the potential for destruction of the structure. So this is a risk that is underestimated from our review. We don't have really good data. That's a region where not only we need to have more data, but we also need to have more awareness building in terms of improving construction practices. Again, especially on St. Thomas and St. John. The next slide, please. Actually, go back to the previous slide. One thing that we also found for the territory is that the previous one is that there is a fair amount of fill. The airport, the waterfront is on fill. Part of St. Croix is also on fill in the Cushing area. The Lantry, Hovens area is also on fill. And it's very unclear, if not unlikely, that when those structures were built, they were taken earthquake risk into account. And what happens often in field land is when you have an earthquake, there's a liquefaction. The soil basically becomes somewhat liquid, like, you know, you jump on sand, you sink in the sand. So there is, again, heightened risk for a lot of those critical infrastructure, because we're talking about, you know, WAPA airport, you know, WAPA, and a lot of the cruise cargo terminals. Next slide. So when there's an earthquake, there's a tsunami. If there's a tsunami, there's an earthquake, right? Whether or not they happen together in the same location, it's a, you know, can happen, cannot happen, but most likely they would happen one after the other, the earthquake leading to the tsunami. So we used the latest result from a series of high resolution modeling that was done by NOAA. The tsunami risk is not as large as what we, you know, was published before, but nonetheless, most of the coastal region are going to be impacted by tsunami. So you can imagine an earthquake, some damage, and now a tsunami. And again, if you look at some of the region, the airport, the waterfront, the WAPA structure, all of the critical facilities which are coastal would be impacted by a tsunami. Again, looking at, you know, government building, so we're talking about a potential breakdown of governance, the government structure in the territory after a tsunami. And again, earthquake followed by tsunami. So earthquake, a lot of people living in the hills suffering a fair amount of damage. Tsunami or earthquake, government being able to function, that poses some significant risk for the territory. Next slide. So we also looked at other type of hazards that are not as you know, important, but should be taken with all seriousness in terms of you know, potential damage. The damage is not as widespread. The risk is slightly lower, but it's still a very important type of hazard that can have devastating consequences if we don't manage them. One is landslide. The landslide will most likely open in regions that are, you know, slope. So anytime you have elevation, there are potential for landslide. Most of St. Thomas and St. John, most of the mountain region of St. Croix. And then for the wildfire will occur when you have a lot of bush, where it's very tend to be very dry. And if, you know, a fire starts, it can spread. So that would happen mostly on St. Croix. The type of vegetation that sort of caused the wildfire in Hawaii, we don't have too much of it here, but the wildfire risk is still something that, you know, we haven't had, because I think the fire bans that the fire department sort of imposes when it gets very dry and very hot seems to, you know, be a good thing. But nonetheless, especially in the last few years where we had severe drought, you know, something bad can happen and create a wildfire that can spread. And most of the region impacted would be in this case St. Thomas. It's mostly the landslide risk that is, the most, the higher. But both islands and all islands, excuse me, in the territory are vulnerable to this risk and hazard. We also looked at man-made hazard. So this is going beyond what FEMA requires for the plan, but is also of interest for the territory. So we looked at what happens if there is a significant accident on the road. So that can happen if we're thinking about some of the water trucks, especially on St. Thomas, who are driving very, very fast, sometimes full of water on the highway, on the road, some of the steep roads. I haven't witnessed too much of that on St. Croix. I know that here things are a little bit calmer, so hopefully your truck drivers are also a little bit calmer, but nonetheless, an accident like that can happen. And so we sort of highlighted the regions where that could happen and looked at the type of damages from the private to the public building that can happen and the consequences. So we can start thinking hopefully about either changing some of the regulation related to speed limits and stuff like that, or relocation of some of the buildings. We also looked at what happens if there is a spill, a hazardous material spill. What we found is that there's actually not really a lot of data in the territory in terms of hazardous material. We don't have the type of repository or database that tells us who owns hazardous material, how they stockpile, etc. So that's something that needs to be addressed sooner than later. What we did was mostly looking at the places where oil is stored. We inventoried also all the gas stations in the territory and sort of looked at, okay, what happens if there is a spill? Those are sort of the major regions that would happen, that would be impacted in a major way if there was any type of hazardous material, mostly gasoline type spill. And then the last thing we did was looking at what happens if there is a airplane accident. We also looked at what happens if there is an accident related to any type of vessel activities. What we find is that most of the maritime vessel activities actually happen around St. Thomas and St. John. There's a lot of private boats, private yachts, private vessels that are moving all around these waters, much more than around Christiansted, as in St. Croix. So when it comes to private accidents that are driven by sort of private owners, most of it will happen in St. Thomas and John. However, there are some major cargo vessels that call in two different regions, and most importantly, there's airplanes on St. Thomas and St. Croix major airport, and so we sort of highlighted the path of if there is an accident during takeoff or during landing, which area will be most impacted. And what we find is that St. Thomas, the damage, the accident, the consequences will be much larger because the airport is right next to a very a large urban region. Yes, one of the question about this one. Well, go ahead with your question.
You may have already said this, but I just wanted to ask, with respect to the road accidents, Hi, this is Sheila Scully. I wanted to ask with respect to the road accidents, and you may have already said this, does the police department or the insurance companies keep actual data as to where the most accidents are happening, and is there a plan for public works to try to prevent that injury?
So I know that there is a record of where the accidents occur, but the police department has those records. One thing that we found is that those records are not in a geo database, meaning that they are not in a way that you can actually map them very easily. It's just a list, and like, an accident happening, like, this road and that road at that time, these are the consequences. So the next step is to actually put like a latitude, longitude, so you can map it, and then you can see, okay, where are those regions where an accident occurs the most. This we haven't found this type of database, but that's something that's, like I said, that's the next step to then be able to say, this is what we need to do at those particular intersections. That's a type of, that's a question that a lot of UVI students are asking. That's a pretty common project that UVI students are sort of embarking upon every year. Because everybody is worried about those questions, but so far the data that we receive in the police department is hard to interpret easily in a way that sort of help make that jump. So yeah, good question. Yes.
Since you bring that up, we have a lot of problem with data collection and analysis, not just for road accidents. So how does the hazard mitigation plan address data collection? Is there going to be funding for that? Is that a part, a critical part of the plan?
Yes, so we made mention of it. We don't provide funding. The hazard mitigation plan does not provide funding. But yes, the fact that it is in the plan helps with accessing funding from different type of agencies. But that's now, you know, our colleagues at Vitina who will have to apply for, or different agencies who will have to apply for.
The point is, this plan is not actionable without the data. So you have to get the data.
And the plan is not actionable if you don't apply for the funding.
That's phase one.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Next slide, next slide. So another type of hazard that we are looking at, as Kim mentioned, is climate change. Last year was hot. It is very hot now. It was raining a lot and it was hot at the same time, which was very weird for me and I guess for you too. This is from NOAA. Last year was the highest on record for Croix. This year is supposed to be hotter, right? So we have to start thinking about how to deal with heat. Maybe the year after next is going to be okay, but now we know it can get very hot and it's likely going to be very hot again, right? So we provide some initial recommendation, but we do make mention of the heat threat in the plan. St. Thomas, we officially, it was the 5th year on record, but from my personal judgment, it was probably the highest, the hottest year on record on St. Thomas. The data collection, going back to the data, the quality of the data collection of St. Thomas is a little bit more complicated and has some issues when it comes to heat. Another threat is drought. We just talked about record-breaking rainfall. We also have witnessed in the past few years record-breaking drought. The territory since 2019 has been in a state of drought, excuse me, overall nearly 80% of the time, right? Anything that is not great means that moderate to extreme drought sort of condition. The island that is most impacted by drought is St. Croix, 90% of the time in a state of drought since 2019. And what we have found is that either it rains a lot or it doesn't rain. It rains a lot and then it doesn't rain. We have a lot of small, short duration drought that happen more often than ever before. If you look at the report from slavery time, from 1920 or whatever, they all talk about drought. They all talk about access to water as being a problem in the territory. But what we found is that it's actually worse than ever before. And then it starts raining. So sort of managing water on all fronts is going to be a big challenge moving forward. Either we have too much of it or we don't have enough of it. And then on top of that, we also have sargassum, right? When we flew down from, please come in, when we flew down from, St. Thomas, we saw a lot of sargassum patches in the ocean. And a friend of mine was asking, hey, Greg, what do you think, like will be the price of water if we have a drought for a year in the Virgin Islands? And I said, well, it depends. If we have a drought in the Virgin Islands for 1 year and it's very hot, it means that a lot of people are going to be using AC. A lot of people are going to be drinking water to cool themselves and hydrate themselves, but they're going to have difficulty finding water. And if we have sargassum on top of that, and we know what happened in St. Croix with the desalination plant, we basically have the perfect storms right here, right? Now imagine after that you have a big rain event that floods everything. You just don't know what to think anymore, what to actually do. So basically what we sort of realized at the end of this exercise is that, I sort of went hurricane, flooding, earthquake, for each of them I sort of presented statistics and what happens and this and that. But the fact is a lot of this can happen all at once in rapid succession. And I think it requires us to sort of change our mindset a little bit on what hazard preparation means or what hazard mitigation means. We're not dealing at silos of hazard. They all can happen together and they can all feed on each other, or the impact can compound one on top of each other. So if we had last week, right? Last week we had rainfall, power outage. I think you had power outage the week before us. We had a power outage that lasted 2 days, pretty much in St. Thomas. It was hot, right? So all of those things compound, right? So we need to start thinking about hazard compounding and impact of hazard compounding next time. And that's why we need to think from a systems point of view, right? We need to sort of start linking different systems together and start thinking about all the assets of one system, what can happen, but also how failure over there can affect failure over here. So my colleagues are probably tired of that story, but I will say nonetheless, last week what I find, in St. Thomas is that we have a nice building, top of the line building with nice lighting and everything. We had a power outage, but the toilet are connected to the power. So you cannot use the toilet during the power outage because it's electronic. So it's nice, saves water and all that stuff. But if there's a power outage, you cannot flush, you cannot wash your hands, you cannot access water, right? But we have a solid building. But to some extent, the building is now becoming useless, right? So it's important because we know that things are linked to each other. And if one can now fail, the other can fail. It's important for us to start thinking about those possible linkages and then start thinking about, okay, now how can I manage, how can I deal with the failure of one to deal with the failure of the other, right? It's very important that we start to think from a systems point of view instead of looking at things in isolation. Next slide. So this is, and the reason why is because things are very complicated, right? It's very, very complicated. This is just a map of the water system for the Virgin Islands. This is good. We have different ways of getting water. But this is not good because unfortunately, those different actors don't talk to each other. Those people are taking care of wells and permitting of wells. WAPA is doing desalination. I don't know if some of you have wells or if you have cistern. I have a cistern, most of us have, right? We all are working individually, but nobody is sort of thinking system-wide, territory-wide. How do all those pieces work together so that if we have a heat wave in a drought and the desalination plant is clogged by sargassum, how can we tap into those other systems to allow everybody to have access to water? So that's the type of things that we start recommending in the plan, is to more dialogue among different partners, among different entities, because we know that hazard compound, impact compound, right? but we have a lot of resources, so how can we work together? How can we think from a systems point of view to address some of these? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the sargassum. How is it being handled by the Virgin Islands now when it happens in various places? And is there anything really good that can be used, that the sargassum can be utilized for?
I think the last part of your question is in the research. People are looking for beneficial reuse or how to properly, do something with it because there's so much of it. I don't know if we have an answer for that yet, but I know other people are looking into it.
Yeah, so we have actually, researched that UBI looking at how it gets here, so how the currents and all that. One of the challenges with sargassum is that when it's offshore, it's protected because it's critical fish habitat. So we can't really like divert it or scoop it out of the water before it ends up on our beaches. And so we actually, it makes sense from a conservation and protecting our fisheries resources, but it costs a lot more to mitigate or remove from our beaches. In fact, we're looking at, what was the estimate, something like
Like $500,000.
yeah, $500,000 just for one beach in one season. So it's a very expensive challenge. In small amounts, it can be used in the fertilizer. It can be rinsed and dried and then pulverized or ground into soil supplements or fertilizers. However, too much of it then adds compounds or chemicals that are bad either for groundwater or for your plants. So it's a management challenge because too little, it's okay, too much, it's a problem, but we can't really remove it until it lands on the beach.
So, am I understanding of this correctly, that you have to really wait until it lands on the beach to do anything about it? It's just.
Yeah, at this point, that's the regulation. In terms of what we are doing about it, I think right now there is a lot of just. Sorry, my phone gets me live for some reason. Yes, so at this point, most of it goes into the landfill, and that's a bit of a problem. And as Kim is saying, a lot of hotels, overall, hotels are spending close to $500,000, just to sort of deal with the problem, just removing it. It's very expensive. It causes all type of negative impact to electronics and stuff, in addition to air quality. So yeah, it's a pressing issue.
I just want to ask about these slides. They're very intense and a lot of information. Are you going to be giving the slides to everybody here?
So all of this information is actually a condensation, a summary, and we omitted a lot of things of what is in the plan. So all the detail is in the plan. We can make those slides public.
You're going to get this.
Yes,
Thank you.
the slide will be on the website.
I know we can, mitigate against everything, but for me, primarily is water. Sick-free to me being number one of an issue, but like when we had all the rains, we watched the water wash out to the ocean, which is another issue. And when we're talking about conservation, where would you guys sit in the area of making something happen? Because for me, if you have a great architect and it's creating this and funds that's coming in and his mind is popping and it's getting out because we want modern things, where would you sit to kind of say, before you get those ideas, this is where we live, this, because I think once that ship is sailing and we kind of start to wave your conservation flag, nobody's gonna listen. We're gonna hit the wall and suffer afterwards. For me, in the past, they had 10,000-gallon cisterns so that water can be saved, because water can be a crisis. And then, like you said, a year goes by, then what? So every cistern is finished, and if we could do that in-ground cistern building to say, okay, we have a new structure building, can we use the foundation of that to be a 10,000-gallon cistern reservoir? In the last how many years have we seen a new big green tank go up because the water tables are dropping, or it's getting to be a higher level of drought, so we should actually have another green conservation. Where do you sit in that realm to advise or to actually cause an effect in reality?
Yeah, so, everything, out of what you said, are really good point. I'm gonna touch upon them in a second, actually, because there's a few things that I wanna, a few slides that are coming up that I think will help answer your question. I don't have the answers in the slides, but I think I would like to show you the slides first and then answer the question. No, let me just go through the slide and then we get back to your question, because there's a few things that if I say it now, I will say it again in the slide. So hold on 1 second, but that's very, very good question. Next slide. So, not exactly to your question, but when we sort of start to think about how the different systems are being managed, it's also important to think about who is the audience, who are we managing those systems for, right? Because when we say WAPA provide power, or WAPA provide water, or Via or Liberty provide telecommunication, it's one thing and it can be an engineering problem. But the fact is, all those systems work for us, for you, me, and everybody else. And so what we did is we sort of started to look at what is the USVI society, where are we at as a society? What we found was a little interesting, and that's work that was done as part of HMRP, but also with some collaborators from DPNR. Larry is one of the co-authors in the room, actually. So what we found is that between now, which is the red line, and 2010 and 2000, which is the black line, we find that the number of young people has decreased by half. The number of people over 65 has doubled. People over 65 are considered disabled. Kim is not a disabled person, but this is what the VI considers at DHS, yes. So don't take it personally, but the Department of Human Services considers everybody over 65 as part of the disabled community. Regardless, let's not, yes, but let's not belabor this point. This is taking a little road by the side that is not necessary. So let's just assume that most of the people over 65 usually are retired, right? And receive social services. So if we are looking at the repartition of the population, what we find is that those over 65, the number of people over 65 has increased both 2000 to 2010 and 2010 to 2020. Whereas pretty much all the other class, especially between 2010 and 2020, especially the working class, those who are actually working, contributing to taxes for the service to be funded, the number has decreased. So what does it mean? It means that really those who are in need of social services the most, the number has increased. Those who are contributing and providing the funding through taxes, through our work, the number has decreased. So there is a bit of a crisis looming of who is and where is the money going to come from and who is going to provide those services when we talk about water, heat, etc. And we know that the needs are not the same. Go next slide. Another thing that we looked at, and this is again just one snapshot, but we have more, is the economy. And we looked at the economy in terms of what is the workforce, and that was a snapshot earlier in terms of we are losing, the number of people from the workforce. We are increasing the number of people who need services. We also looked at, different type of economies. What we found is that most of the USVI is made of very small businesses, 1 or 2 person, not very large employers. So again, the vulnerability of the economy is actually quite something we need to pay attention to. What we also looked at is what is the cost of bad infrastructure in the territory? So this is an example of road condition pre-hurricane on St. Croix, where everything with a 5 is excellent condition, everything close to 0 is bad condition. And so we asked the question, how much does it cost overall for us to repair our car? So we're talking about tires, suspension, etc., right? And what we found is that on St. Croix, because of the bad road, $12 million gets spent overall in car maintenance. On St. Thomas, it's close to 5 million, and St. John is $250,000. But what that means is that all this money is being spent and not doesn't stay in the territory, because, you know, where do we get our parts from? In the mainland or the places. So there is this bad condition. All the infrastructure is a siphon of money leaving the territory, right? And not contributing to the economy. Next slide. We looked at all different types of systems. We also looked at the healthcare system. So in this case, you know, I won't go through all what the slide says, but basically overall what we find is that not enough doctors for the type of population, not enough specialists, a lot of rotation. Every time you go see a doctor, it's a different person, etc., etc. And that also reduces, increases our vulnerability and ability to cope. So the goal here is to kind of show you the type of work that we've done to sort of illustrate the fact that when we think about hazard and hazard impact, we should not just think about, oh, my roof is stronger, you know, my road is better, and everything is going to be good. We need to look at things in a slightly larger way and start to make connection and sort of link the recipient of the service to the service provider. So in this case, if we are thinking about mitigation for healthcare, we need to address the hospital situation from a building standpoint, but we also need to spend time thinking about providers, thinking about access to care, all those other issues that have to do with the governance structure of the system. If we think about water, it's the same thing. Next slide. If we think about land use, it's the same thing, and I'm going to start to get to your point. So what we find is that, you know, since 1985 to 2020, the population, you know, has gone up and now is going down, and now it's estimated to be more than 80,000, so it's over here. In the meantime, the amount of green space has decreased, the amount of impervious surface or built has increased. So what does it mean? Next slide. So what it means is that if St. Croix was looking like that in the 80s, this is what St. Croix looks like now, with a lot of impervious surface developed area. This is good in a sense that more development, more businesses, more activity could be more economic activity. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what we see, but what it also means is that the amount of green space is decreasing. Next slide. This is St. Thomas, same thing, a whole lot more development, you know, in pretty much all of St. Thomas except the sort of border or side area. Next slide. This is St. John, the national park cannot be touched, and everything outside of the national park is being developed. Next slide. So what does that mean, right? What it means is that if this is a rainfall event, and the rainfall event haven't changed in terms of meteorite rates, but the consequence has changed, right? So Bethlehem got on St. Croix, the blue line represents the amount of stormwater that would have happened in 1985. The red line represents the amount of stormwater that happens now, right? Because of all this construction. The problem, so we have more stormwater now that we have to manage because of this development that we saw, right? One of the problems, though, is that the number of people has declined. The source of revenues has also declined. So now we have to deal with more problems with less money. Next slide. So it's very important for us to then start thinking about how we manage our land, how we manage our waters, how we manage our natural resources in a way that does not increase risk, because that has been the trajectory that we have been on since, you know, the last 40, 50 years. So this is an example of an exercise that we went through where we sort of said, what if we continue with current trend? What if we look at an intermediate scenario where we allow some development, but we start to create some rules about how to develop, where to develop? And what if we stop development, put a lot of restriction, and just concentrate new development in regions that are already developed. And what we find is that if we go and try to start, from current to smart growth, there is a decrease in the total amount of assets at risk and potential losses. So what it means is that changing the way that we develop, changing the way that we think about development is something very necessary for us if we want to start decreasing the amount of flooding that we see or the amount of damage that we experience, or overall diminishing the risk in a territory.
Has the land use plan used the information from this mitigation plan?
So that's very good. That was my segue. We shared our information with the land use plan team. The lead is behind you, Hilary. And I think they are planning to do some public meetings where they will release some of their findings. We were not part of that team, but we did share everything with them. I don't know, Hilary, if you want to say anything.
No.
No? Okay. So that's it.
Yeah.
Well, when you
Down.
Right.
Why not? All right, so we have town hall meetings in June, 24th, St. John, 5th, 27th, St. We'll be rounding out all the information that is going to be in the land use plan will be available on the project website in SCI by June 10th. It's right now rounding these sort of technical partners. It does include this HMRP team, and then it will go to peer review to be available to look at online before the meetings, and then available for discussion after the meetings.
So I encourage you to keep up and attend those meetings, because I think, as we found, we didn't look at all the attributes that they were looking at. We mostly focused on hazard and risk, and better managing our land and our resources can go a long way in mitigating risk. Now, to your question, I think, like I said, you have a very good point. Like you saw, more development leads to more stormwater, so limiting the amount of development, or better thinking about the development that we have, especially given the declining population, can go a long way in helping, decreasing or thinking about ways to manage our stormwater. One project that DPNR is leading is looking at where in St. Croix can we sort of create recharge areas where stormwater can be directed, absorbed into the ground, going into the aquifer, so that you can now pump it out, and have access to fresh water. So that's a beneficial reuse. There's also a lot of talk for the creation of stormwater retention pond, where can you send the water in a particular location, store it. Farmers can have access to it after some treatment, or can infiltrate to the ground, and we can reuse it. So thinking about ways to minimize or decrease the amount of water going to the ocean is something that is critical. What we also found is that actually, if we don't manage the way that this water goes and ends up in the ocean, it can create more slides and more erosion along the coast. So it can have some negative impact if we don't properly manage the stormwater. Your point about the cistern is also a very good one, because, like I said, it's dry, or it rains hard, or it's dry. And when it's dry, it can last for a really long time. So increasing the sources, the resources, the reservoir, storage of stormwater is something that, or rainwater is something that, we also talk about. I know that in the plan, we talk about maybe looking at the Bethlehem systems, millions of gallons that it's, able to store. Let's restore, what about, some of the schools, most of them are on water. They store water there. There's different ways to store water, but what it requires coordination. Because it's one thing to store water, it's another thing to have somebody or somebody sort of say, now we're going to tap into this, now we're going to tap into that. How much do we have over here? It's a lot of work, right? But that's part of thinking from a systems point of view. That's part of governance, which is the last piece that we're going to talk about.
And you bring to mind another point, it's not just quantity, it's quality.
Yes.
Okay, because there's a lot of water cisterns that are unused right now with water in them. In government properties, government buildings, housing communities because of the quality. So we got to also be concerned about the quality of water, how we maintain that quality.
So one project I just want to say that hopefully you're gonna hear some results in a year and a half is again, TPNR and working with them on that. We are looking at the where is saltwater lands in the Kingsley Aquifer, right? Because a lot of farmers are saying, my water is getting salty, my water is getting salty. So that's something that we need to monitor, see how far the salt water is, so we can say, if we recharge, where should we recharge in a way that, we actually can tap into this water in a safe way.
With farmland or any well needing to have a fresh water and it being corrupted with salt water coming in, what would be the cause of that and how to mitigate against that as well? The other thing I want to say, like she had said, maintenance is a maintenance piece that has to happen when conservation happens to make it effective. We had lots of ponds, kids were drowning them, things were going them, and then decisions were made, let's just let it go. But then we had dry season that you could dig it out, clean it out, to prepare for the wet season, but that management piece don't seem to exist. Do you guys have a say in that?
Well, so much because we're not a public agency and that's not the goal. The goal of the plan is to identify hazard and make recommendation. But again, a lot of what you mentioned, are valid points. My answer is that through dialogue and bring the different parties together at the same table, you can identify the problem and identify the solutions, right? So if somebody said it's a safety issue, somebody said it's a mosquito issue, there actually are solutions. But you can actually have air circulation, water circulation that prevents, say, mosquito breeding. You can put a fence around it that prevents people getting into it. So, what it requires is coordination. What it requires is that different parties are coming together at the same time. People are thinking about a larger system. In terms of the physics or the mechanism for salt water or water getting salty, there's two main reasons. One is overpumping. If you pump too much, some minerals are going to get concentrated in the water that is there. And at that point, it's very difficult for that water to become non-saline. It takes decades. So overpumping, not paying attention to how much you pump, can actually compromise your source of water. And that is one of the reasons why WAPA, for example, had to stop some of their drilling or well intervention because they were pumping too fast. Another reason is sea level rise. Basically, below us is pores. The fresh water is pushing and ending into the ocean, so it prevents some of the water to get in. As sea level increases, now that seawater has more force to push the fresh water in the other direction, and slowly salt water is getting underground, right? And so the way to prevent, so we cannot stop sea level rise. It's a bit too late for that. We can reduce the rate of increase, but we cannot stop it. The machine is already running from a global sort of climate change point of view. But what we can do, if we understand where that salt water lands is and how fast it's moving landward, what we can do is we can actually pump more fresh water into the aquifer to sort of hold back, right? So that's one strategy that can be applied. But first, we need to better understand where we can do it. And second, we need to stop developing on top of the aquifer. All right, next slide. So again, thinking about population and the type of people who are receiving, the services. So one of the last things that we've done the team and some of the partners, including DPNR, is look at what's called a vulnerable population or social vulnerability, which is a combination of quality of housing, income, number of people, age of people in a home, and all of that gets combined into an index where darker colors are where there is a high concentration of people with high social vulnerability, which is, mostly socioeconomic challenges. Lighter colors are where people of less social vulnerability reside. What we find is that if those places are also, especially on St. Thomas, places where roads get flooded often, where building gets flooded often, meaning that not only those people have difficult socioeconomic condition, but when it rains, the home is damaged. And we can also think about other types of hazard or challenges when it comes to hazard and hazard impact and access to services. And so what we found also is that those are the places where after the hurricane, people have left. So anytime you see a red down arrow, it means a loss of population between 2010 and 2020. Anytime you see a green arrow going up, it means people have moved there. There's a gain in population. So what we see is that overall, those who have left, the 20,000 people who left the territory after the hurricane, mostly come from the most socially vulnerable area. And the way we interpret this is that they probably left because damage to the structure, but also potentially difficulty accessing services, difficulty getting water, getting power, getting food, getting a job, all of that, in addition to just the structure being damaged. So I wanted to finish this slide to kind of say that, it's important that we sort of think comprehensively about hazard, and we also think about the receiver of the service when we think about hazard mitigation, because if not, we're going to see more of this. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, those are the people who contribute to taxes, to jobs, etc., etc. So it makes recovery even harder, and it makes living even harder, right? So hazard mitigation is very important, and thinking about it in a comprehensive way is very important because the future is quite complicated. Next slide. This sort of summarizes what I said. We need all those sectors to live a good life, and if we don't sort of think about how they interact, if we don't all come together and sort of think about how we can solve those problems in a systemic way, when this hazard occurs, we can have a lot of chaos that leads to people living. It's a bit cartoonish, but I think it sort of represents some of, what we're talking about. Next slide. So the last piece of the plan is practicing governance, thinking about governance structure. How are we going to organize ourselves? We think about systems, we make all the linkages, but we still need some form of governance structure, some form of group of people, some form of laws and regulation who say, this is how everything will work. And what we find next time is that there are some challenges when it comes to governance in the territory. Most agencies that we talked about limited management capacity, limited capacity. Some of it is because there's just not enough people, a lot of people have left, but some of those issues predate the hurricane in terms of how we manage ourselves, how different agencies and groups manage themselves. There's an issue of maintenance, issue of sharing of information. It's very difficult to find information. It's very difficult to create standards for information sharing that would allow for later people making better decisions because they have more information in their hand. We also find that a lot of agencies and lack of comprehensive understanding of the hazard and do not have a good sense of how their work connect to somebody's work, even sometimes within the same agencies, right? So sort of help improving some of those mechanisms for sharing information, sharing data, sharing resources is critical from our point of view if we want to achieve resilience, limited coordination and integration across agencies and sectors. Who's in charge of water? Who's in charge of power? WAPA is in charge of power, but really no, it should just be WAPA, right? A lot of different places have generators or people have solar. We need to start thinking about energy in a slightly different way that WAPA produces power. WAPA is on, I have power. WAPA is not on, I don't have power. I think we need to move beyond some of those thinking instead of think a bit more, in a different way about what water means, about what power means, about what communication means. For some reason last week, after the storms, there was issues with telephones, and we didn't know why. We didn't receive any information. Is there any other way that we can sort of think about sharing information, sharing resources to have access to that service that we need? And that's the last point, is that what we find is that there is actually a lot of information available. There is actually a lot of knowledge, but it's not shared. It only shares through a network that can be exclusionary. I don't know you, I will not share with you. And that goes against us ultimately because decision cannot be made. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide.
Okay.
I think this is a lot of what I talked about. So we go in the plan, we can read a lot of what I mentioned in the plan. And the last piece of the plan is the recommendation. So we provide a series of recommendations for all the sectors. I won't go into all of them. A lot of these education, AC to classrooms. It's one thing to make a recommendation. It's another thing to implement it. And I want to say that because I don't want anybody to underestimate the amount of work that it will require to say, provide AC to classrooms, right? This is a big task because if you look at the schools, they were built in a time where heat was not a concern. They also have management issue and maintenance issue that maybe you think, oh, that has nothing to do with AC, but it does. Because if the pipe is no good, well, the electrical is probably not good, right? Because it's a whole maintenance issue, it's a whole approach. So to provide AC to classroom, you need to address windows, you need to address walls, you need to address electrical, and then you need to purchase the AC, find the talents to install the AC for you, right? So there is a lot of steps. But the first thing is to sort of recognize this interconnection, to recognize all those steps, and then sort of move on with a plan to provide AC to classroom, right? So thinking system, having a good governance structure, where information and tasks are spread in a way that makes sense to be able to manage that risk, which is heat, right? We cannot sort of say, I'm going to purchase AC, $5, here you go, purchase AC. That is, if you don't do all of what I said, you're going to end up spending $1,000 a month electricity, and you're going to say, oh, I can't do that anymore. So thinking system, having good governance structure really help manage those. Next slide. Next slide. So we sort of organize all those, recommendation into in a big matrix, and for each of them we have a timeline: short-term, medium-term, long-term. We also sort of provide ideas from funding sources of where the government can start writing grant to get the funding. But again, getting the funding is not the end, right? It's not because you got a grant that the thing is going to happen. You need to have the governance structure in place. You need to have the mentality of thinking, what are the connections, how does the system work, who are my clients, who are the receivers of the service, so that you better manage the system as things change, you maintain it, so that it lasts longer, and you can then achieve the goal that you were after. But it's a lot of work, and getting the grant is just the first step. Next slide. So like I said, the plan is online. There will be a QR code, so get your phone ready, figure out how to read QR code. It always takes me like 10 seconds to figure it out every time. But the plan is online. It's organized by chapters. It has more information that I presented to you today. We actually have even more information in appendices that we're going to publish very soon. So you can have access, if you are interested in arts and culture, if you are interested in telecommunication, if you are interested in water, you can read in detail, even more than what we present in the plan. We also would like some of your feedback and comments. The clock started ticking last Tuesday. So 30 days from last Tuesday, so 20 days from now, is when the comment period is going to end. So please, tonight, tomorrow, this weekend, go online and start reading and providing comments. We're going to take all those comments and as much as possible answer them, but also if we can change some of the content of the plan in a limited fashion, we will do so to address your comments. And before, I take your question, please, next slide. So I can show the QR code. This will take you to the plan. Okay, question.
I'm trying to save.
You have a whole list written on that. Oh, how many pages?
I'm not going to answer something that answered, but okay, in the landfill, St. Thomas is a lot of landfill. And a lot of government agencies are on there. Finance is there, personnel is there. Is the government doing anything to say move these guys because it has records? And what if they're doing to archive those records and do something so that if the disaster, so the earthquake comes into town.
I thought you said landfill. That's what you
Land,
She means filled.
Oh, really? Okay, I was in garbage. I was like.
fill land,
Okay.
right, fill land. But what are they doing to make, they need to move those buildings. If something happens and a disaster happens and they go down, that's gonna be a lot of government records. Government won't be able to function.
Okay, so there's two things in your question. There's something about government records and there's something about building in field plan.
Yeah.
So on the last is the government record. I know that DPNR again got a large grant to archive and digitize a lot of the archive. So that's a very good step because a lot of paper record got lost after the hurricane. We also make note in the plan that we need to move everything to digital because there's still a lot of things that are done on paper. And so as a territory, we need to move as much as possible all the operation online. It's going to make management of some processes easier, and it's going to minimize the loss of information if something happens to a particular building. In terms of your question about the building and building on field land, that's a very good question. Like I mentioned to you, as far as I know, I haven't seen any document that told me that the airport of St. Thomas, which was built in the 70s, was built in a way that if we have a magnitude 5, 6, whatever earthquake, we will not have a destruction of the facility, right? There are methods to actually mitigate or address that risk, where they do some injection of some type of material, they do some reinforcement. You don't have to move the building if you can treat the soil in the ground or the building itself. In California, they're doing a lot of retrofit of buildings where they put some, metal bars outside to sort of provide additional support, additional wave for the, earthquake waves to, be diverted in a different location. So there's things that you can do to a building itself. Sometimes it's too expensive, then you need to start thinking about relocation. But that's a very good point. We made that point in the plan. That is something that needs to be addressed as soon as possible. Another thing that we make in the plan is that a lot of those houses on stilts, need to be potentially stopped providing building permits for houses on stilts. And we also provide recommendation how to close them to mitigate, because the problem is that if you have too little stilts, that's where the wave, the earthquake wave will, have a really good time. But if you close it, you create more pathways for the wave to sort of dissipate its energy and prevent the collapse of the building.
Is there any, where in the plan for the, legislation as far as changing rules, like, should we be building on our coastline?
Yeah, so we're not recommending that, but I don't know if in part of the land and water use plan, you guys are addressing this.
Yeah, so, we are addressing it in as much as close as this gets to recommendations. It's like a blueprint that gets adopted, that goes for adoption by the legislature, so that would be sort of more on the hook than this plan, or a different hook. This is sort of for FEMA funding, and that is to the local legislature. I do think Greg is making a very important point, which is that I think that having a hazard mitigation and resilience plan, we are one of the only states and territories to have resilience. The HMP is always required, and a lot of states kind of do that pretty rote. We should just take a minute to, honor the fact that Kim and I were just at a meeting with this in the Southeast, where a lot of partners were really, I believe we got a small round of applause for the fact that the territory decided to embark on it this way. And again, for the comprehensive land and water use plan, a lot of other jurisdictions have already had one for a while, and that is great. But the opportunity here is that ours is now baked with climate resilience in it, because we haven't had one until climate resilience came to the fore. And so those are the opportunities I see in the way that the plans are now. But it's really important to note that these are just like this and the comprehensive land and water use plan sheds light on the data that we do and don't have. So we're in a place where we want more streamlined and data-driven decisions, but the first place to start in a lot of those cases is to collect data. And so that sits all over this plan, as well as the comprehensive land and water use plan. But once we get those adopted, someone has to find the right grant, someone has to write the grant, someone has to administer the grant, and someone has, and oversee the work to be done, not just as pointed to, respectfully enough, in all of these plans that point at things but don't provide fine print. I'll bring it back to, should we be developing in steep slopes and coastlines? Those are two things that are directly highlighted in the comprehensive land and water use plan as well. But it doesn't go as far as say, here's starting now, adopting this plan is officiating tomorrow. For example, if you adopt this today, it doesn't change where you can build the next day. It's saying we're getting on a path where something needs to change, and it needs to be a data-driven decision. So someone needs to embark on that. And so it's blueprints across the board, which is both not the same thing as providing resolutions to a lot of these pretty long-standing problems, but they are sort of more clean lines of blueprints than I think the territory's had in a while. And couple that with still a lot of, hazard mitigation money from the hurricanes that just wallops the whole territory, as well as this current Biden administration and a lot of congressional monies that's passed for a lot of bipartisan infrastructure law and things like that. So we're in a position where the opportunity is pretty high, but it is a huge time consuming and human being required undertaking to move from plans to polished product.
The baby step that I would say though is that actually with Hillary and the CCM, we are going to be providing some recommendation to change some of the setback distance regulation in the territory, so that people at least, sort of start having a little bit more rationale behind how close or how far from the water you can build. And that will be not only for beaches, but also cliffs and further type of, because we're finding that cliffs are eroding. We're also finding that, waves are going further inland than the legislation sort of, provides. And we're also finding that, the coastal public space is being threatened by erosion, by commercialization of it and other sort of forces. So that's one thing that we're gonna, provide recommendation for very soon to the legislation is the setback distance sort of regulation. But as Hilary said, it's the result of, data collection, understanding of the process, and then after that, there's a whole legal step, review that needs to happen. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Urge to stand up and give an ovation. Please just do it.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. As I was looking through the plan and doing my searches, I didn't see a whole lot of the NGO, nonprofit, faith-based organizations mentioned. And how they're going to be folded in.
Yeah,
That's going to be important. I don't know if any of them are represented here, but I think there needs to be an extra effort in that regard because FEMA is looking to reach out to arts and culture.
no, and I think it got a little bit diluted in our effort to minimize the size of the document, but that's a very good point. Please provide that comment in your review. We're going to try to beef it up. We have a whole document on just that. Actually Janine and some other colleagues were lead on that, spent a lot of time interviewing different NGOs, arts and culture groups from the government, from outside the government. And what we find is that, like everything, there is not a very strong governance structure. Everybody is pretty much on their own. Everybody pretty much does their own thing. And when hard times come, there's a scramble, but there is no sort of place for everybody to sort of get together and get organized. And so we make mention of that, also make mention of the fact that the government turns to NGO in times of crisis, but outside of those times, they don't really reach out or cultivate this relationship. And it's very hard to only reach out to somebody when you need them and not sort of on a regular basis sort of develop this relationship. Because what you lose is you lose opportunities to build something to address some issues when things are well, so that when things are not so well, you don't suffer as much. So there is a lot of things that we found in terms of potential for strengthening the relationship between government and non-government entities. And we also make the case that arts and culture is what unites us when times are hard. But if we don't have it, on a regular basis, they're not gonna pop out of nowhere, and it will lead to a sense of displacement. It will lead to a sense of isolation. It will lead to despair, and people will leave. Because ultimately, that slide that I showed you about where people have left after the hurricane, I mean, that's the consequence of not managing the hazard and the stress. At some point, people say, I'm done, I'm leaving. So there's a real consequence to all of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm 100% behind everything you said just now. We tend to have a culture of competition instead of collaboration. And that is something that not only applies to non-governmental and government, but even in the government sector, like you were saying, there needs to be more collaboration, okay, between the public works and the WAPA and whoever else. And that is really important going forward, because otherwise, we don't have the capacity in one agency or one nonprofit to get it all done.
And that's what we in the think system and practicing governance, that's something that we identify. That's something we heard. The thing is, you say that's the reality, but that's also what the agency staff are saying. They're saying, we don't collaborate as much. We don't share information as much. So it's something that a lot of government employees have also identified as, a problem that prevents us from becoming more resilient.
And my last comment, for us 65 and over disabled people. There's a guide to expanding mitigation that FEMA and AARP did called making the connection to older adults. And I did not see anything about older adults, and the only thing you commented on was that we're disabled.
So, yes, one thing, and I will improve that in the, yes, I will improve that, slide. No.
For older adults who have different vulnerabilities.
So we actually, part of the same comment as the housing culture, we actually have a whole section on, you know, what is the situation when it comes to people with disabilities in a territory. It is in an appendix. I forgot who we contacted for that. It was a UVI faculty, but we have a whole section. I actually had a slide that I removed to try to limit the amount of slide. I will put that slide back if you can listen to the St. Thomas.
I'm not asking for disability, because I am over 65 and I am not disabled. Okay, I'm just as good as anybody else. So what I'm trying to tell you is you need a section on older adults.
Got it. Yes,
Thank you.
over 65. Yeah, I know.
I'm
Good.
just saying, I'm not saying it, but don't forget the older ones who are able.
Right, and to be clear, if the characterization of vulnerability is that you're over 65 and you live alone, it's another element. If you live in a family or you have, you know, siblings or whatever, that designation doesn't hold. It's what they're trying to do is identify vulnerable folks who live alone, who might be isolated for whatever reason. And so that's the other element that we should have mentioned in going on. Point out, I am over 65. I am available, but I feel very confident. So,
Yeah, I mean, yes, and again, we should not take anything personal.
No, no.
Those maps, I was just going with what, Department of Human Services, you know, was saying, but your point is very well taken. And again, put that in the comments, and we will address it, but we do have a whole section on vulnerable population and disabled population. I just want to make sure, because that was also, from early on in this planning process.
Dr. Mills.
Yeah, yeah, that's something that, you know, people were saying, you know, people with disability need more assistance after disaster. And so we took the time to actually bring some of those issues in the plan, because it's a very serious issue.
All right, any other questions, comments? All right, well, on behalf of my team and UBI and my colleagues, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. Please take advantage of this opportunity to provide comments, help us make it a stronger, more useful plan for the territory. So we really value and want to hear from you in this time period. If nothing else, I want to wish you a safe travel home and thank you again for joining us this evening.